Good afternoon. I'm Myla Cooper. I'm the director of the Coretta Scott King Center. It is my great pleasure and joy to welcome you to this afternoon's program. On behalf of the president and all of the phenomenal staff and faculty and students of Antioch College, we especially want to welcome our alumni. If you're an alumna, raise your hand. Woo, let's give a round of applause to our phenomenal and committed and loyal alumni, and a special shout out to the class of 67. Woohoo! But we also have some very special community guests. We're not going to introduce them all, obviously, but we do want to let you know we are a collaborative college, and so we are excited that we have so many of our community members here joining in this afternoon's session. If there was any time that we need to speak truth to power, it is now. So I am excited that the class of 67, under Karen's leadership, selected this as a theme. I know there's envy of the t-shirt going on. I can let you know where I got it. But we do have a small memento for those of you who are interested. We have these buttons that say Speak Truth to Power. We're just asking for a small donation to cover our costs, $3. If you want to stretch it to $5, we'll be happy to do that as well. If one of our students, Anna Samaki, if you would please stand, class of 2019, give her a hand. She has the buttons available, so you want to see her before you leave, we'll be happy to give you one, and you can wear it all weekend. And so without further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce our fearless leader, our president, Dr. Tom Manley, who is going to come at this time.
Thank you so much, Myla. Welcome, everyone. Especially welcome to our alumni and our students and our faculty and community members. And we want to welcome our friends and guests from Dayton and beyond, and a very warm welcome to you, Derrick Johnson. We're honored that you're here with us. So as Myla said, Antioch College is deeply privileged to be the home of the world's only Coretta Scott King Center. In her autobiography, Coretta described Antioch like this: the college was a pioneer in multicultural living and education, and it prided itself on being a laboratory for democracy. That's still true today, although we understand all too well that laboratories are places for experimentation and therefore places that are imperfect, places that make mistakes. We then work to correct those mistakes, and we avoid self-congratulation along the way. We've also realized, along with being a laboratory for democracy, that the practice of democracy is hollow unless it includes the twin practice of social justice. Antioch has, for a long time, and deeply been committed to the struggle for social justice. And it's in keeping with our continuing commitment to being a laboratory for both deliberative democracy and social justice that we are so honored to have Derrick Johnson with us today, and on the occasion of the Antioch College Alumni Association's 9th reunion since the college was reopened. That's an applause line. Now, Derrick will be introduced by his friend Larry Rubin in a moment. I'd like to take the opportunity to say a few words about Larry, class of 1965, who is one of our 5 Antioch Alumni Award recipients this year. There's no easy way to describe what being an Antiochian means, And I might add, if you're not an Antiochian, there's no easy way always to know how to deal with Antiochians. But I think one could do worse than to take a photograph of Larry Rubin and distribute it and ask us to put it on our mirrors and every day try to measure up. Larry has led an exemplary life of activism and public service, and he's done it on the front lines of the practice of democracy and social justice. Still in his teens and an Antioch student, Larry became a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee member, SNCC, in Mississippi and Georgia starting in 1961, and continued on through 1965, becoming one of the few full-time SNCC organizers. Larry was also mostly stationed in Holy Springs, Mississippi, working at freedom schools and in voter drives as a field organizer. He was one of the very courageous freedom riders in the Deep South, and for his efforts, he was rewarded by being beaten and arrested multiple times. As you know, many of these volunteers put their lives on the line, and some of them made that ultimate sacrifice. Larry knew that continuing on doggedly, going door to door, a white kid from Philadelphia, even after being jailed, even after being beaten, even after his picture had been published in the newspaper and he had been identified as a communist. Larry went on to work in the labor movement for 5 decades. Today, he continues as a volunteer with Teaching for Change and is an advisor to Black Lives Matter. Larry is just one of the many, many individuals for whom Antioch has provided an education, an experiential frame that allows them to achieve what Horace Mann demanded of all of us, victories for humanity. And as president, I'm so very proud and honored to be part of this Antioch community and this legacy, and part of a college that continues to provide this type of powerful, life-changing, world-altering, and globally aware education. And I'm happy to say that if you would still like to have this kind of education, we're enrolling students now. So here's Larry Rubin.
Tom, thank you very much. And it's true that Antioch is part of my soul. But I doubt whether putting my picture up on a mirror is going to encourage people to continue. Maybe if they turn it around, that might help. I could stand here and laud our keynote speaker for hours. So instead of doing that, and to make sure that he has some time to actually speak, I wrote down some notes just to keep me on track. Of some leaders, people say they did it for us. But of great leaders, people say we did it ourselves. Derrick Johnson is that kind of a leader. He is the exact kind of leader we need today to defeat Trumpism. Too many people today have lost faith in their own collective power. Too many whites express their feelings of hopelessness by voting for Trump. Too many blacks express their feeling of hopelessness by not voting. But Derrick's whole life has been dedicated to helping to bring people together to really fix things. Not like Trump said, only I and I alone can fix things. And we see what's happening today. with him fixing things. If winning victories for humanity is the main dictum of Antioch College, Derrick is an Antiochian, and he didn't even have to go here. In Mississippi, he's everywhere. He helped organize a movement to make fully funded quality education a human right within the Mississippi Constitution. He's helping communities across the state to form electric co-ops so that neighbors, if they get together, can get cheaper power. And he's working to help over 4,000 employees in a huge Mississippi auto factory to get beyond each other's skin color and to understand if they get together and vote for a union, it will help everybody. And that's the Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi, which just 2 days ago announced that they have asked the NLRB for a date for an election. But Derrick, as president of the Mississippi Conference NAACP, has been there from the beginning, helping. And he's working nationally to unleash the power of today's civil rights movement. I first met Derrick about 4 years ago when we were planning a conference in Jackson, which a lot of Antioch students went to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. The walls of Derrick Johnson's office in Jackson, Mississippi, still have bullet holes from when the Klan or whoever was trying to kill Medgar Evers. Eventually, they succeeded. But Derrick has taken his place. He has the exact same position that Medgar Evers had. I know he sees himself as a direct descendant of the work that SNCC did, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because we believed in organizing, not in leading. But the fact of the matter is that Derrick every day fights a system that's much more complex. It's still as racial, still as racist, and still as unjust as the system back in the 60s. But it's much more complex, much harder to fight today, and he's doing it. We were at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention together. Remember that? We were sitting in a hotel, and it was Chris Matthews to the left of us, and Representative so-and-so to the right of us, and Senator so-and-so surrounding us. And they were all sitting there, and drinking, I should say, trying to impress each other with their big shotness. And I got to tell you, I was not exactly immune to this. I was turning around and, Derrick, look, you're so-and-so, you're so-and-so. And he said, you know, what's said at this convention doesn't matter at all. It matters what they do when they go back home. But Derrick is not just about winning victories today. He is constantly working to train young people for winning victories in the future. And he started an organization which does that, called One Voice. Actually, the only time I've seen Derrick flustered, we were at a conference where us elders were supposed to impart our wisdom to young people, particularly from Black Lives Matter. And Derrick gave the opening speech. And then these kids started to talk about tweets and likes and computer stuff. And Derrick's point was they shouldn't confuse the number of likes with real organizing. But actually, there was nobody there to translate what these kids were talking about anyway. So I could go on. Like I said, I could spend hours talking about Derrick. But I'm very eager to introduce the man who is giving millions of people today across this country hope that we can defeat Trumpism. I give you Derrick Johnson.
So first of all, I don't know if I can live up to the introduction, so let me lower your expectations right now. I do want to thank Larry Rubin for initiating the invitation, and Karen for calling, and Mila for picking me up from the airport, and Dr. Manley for allowing this space for the opportunity, and for a wonderful conversation I had with Jan at lunch. It was a great moment for me to understand the history of Antioch. I'm a graduate of Tougaloo College, HBCU in Mississippi, with a very similar mission. We are trained around our role in today's reality to be social justice activists. I can recall when I first got to Tougaloo College campus, and the president at the time seen me and two other students. We were becoming student leaders, and Dr. Shakira says, "You three, get over here. We have a history of protesting. If y'all not protesting, I can't raise money." So we start protesting because we need to raise money. But I want to start with the story Larry was ending with. It was a conference that we pulled together, individuals who are part of the SNCC Legacy Group, along with several of the young people that make up the many groups that is now known either as the Movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Movement. And we knew many of these individuals because they came through several iterations of training programs, relationships, or us funding them to convene to talk about issues, particularly issues around social justice and police brutality. In fact, we had the group from Florida, the Dream Defenders, Phil Agnew, who's now known as Umi. He was there, and we brought in Umi, the young lady who helped the Dreamers begin to demonstrate against the deportation. Had a lot of people there. Opal, who was one of the known founders of Black Lives Matter movement, and the SNCC veterans, who I'm very fond of. Very small group of individuals, and one of my mentors, Hollis Watkins, is how I began to develop my political view of what movement should look like. Well, they are sharp, and they realized that there was a disconnect between what they seen as movement and what the new generation was seeing as movement, and there's a few of us like right in the middle. I don't know if I'm the part of the young group or the old group right now. I'm like somewhere in the middle. And so they gassed me up to go and be the opening speaker, and they told me what to say. And foolishly, I carried their water. But it was important because we were talking about social justice movement and voting. We had all of these really, really talented young people in the room. Many of whom we had began to work with over the past 2 years, and they gained national notoriety. I've been on a plane all night long, so I'm gonna chop up a lot of words. And I opened up and I say, Ferguson was a failure. Ferguson was a failure. And many of these young people had spent days and a few weeks there, almost 24 hours, broadcasting what was taking place. Because I say a black man was shot by a police officer And with all of the attention that has taken place, an election has come and gone, and in that 67% African-American city, the same political leadership that was in place that allowed that police officer with the nerve to shoot a human being, they're still in place. Those young people were upset. Like, what do you mean? We are in an era where many people confuse social justice and social media. And I went on to say that as young activists, you all did a great thing to democratize the media and communications. We can see what's going on unfiltered by corporate media outlets. That's a wonderful thing. That was a success, but the success is not based on your ability to tell the story. The success always has to be whether or not the quality of lives of the individuals who live in the reality has changed after the work, after the demonstration. And in Ferguson, it did not change, because it was still the same political leadership in place. Now, I tried to soften that conversation by telling them also that Selma was a failure. And we celebrate Selma every year, go to Edmund Pettus Bridge, people come down. But if you think about it, 2 marches, the brutality that individuals had to confront by trying to walk across the bridge, John Lewis, I mean, you know, some of the SNCC guys, they tease John, say, John, you know, we love you, but you gotta have the hardest head we've ever seen. Both he was stubborn, and he would take his upside his head. I mean, both, you know, I'm just repeating what they say. I'm not saying that. All right, but you think about it. International press for Selma. Around the world, they looked in what was taking place in Alabama in 1965. It was atrocious. Can you imagine individuals simply trying to walk across a bridge to be faced with that level of brutal retaliation from law enforcement? But in 1965, the mayor of Selma was a gentleman by the name of Smitherman. Selma at this time was 70% African American. Mayor Smitherman stayed in office until 2000. Selma was a failure. And so as we wrap our brain around social justice movements, we really need to begin to think about what are the outcomes we are seeking. Are we protesting for the sake of protesting? Are we demonstrating for the headlines? Are we utilizing all of the energy of the people who are seeking solutions in a way in which we're taking them down a path where they would never see a solution? That's the beautiful thing about a place like Antioch College. That we can give our young people the intellectual frame to critically think through what outcomes we should be considering in this social justice fight. That our young, energetic students who want to see the world as a better place need to have the comfort, the security of having the space to think through critical issues and come up with very viable solutions in which they don't mislead the people who are seeking their support. That's what I learned at Tougaloo College. I learned that no matter what I am doing, it's not about me and I'm only a dash in a relay run of a marathon. I'm a part of a continuum. And that continuum, for me, I can trace back that all the way from the Civil War in Mississippi. And I'm a Detroiter. See, because I'm clear that the Civil War was fought not because of the rightness or wrongness of slavery. It was fought because there was a set of rich guys in the North who wanted to change our national policy, to support an industrial-based economy, and a set of rich guys in the South was making so much damn money off of a slavery economy, they didn't want to change it. That was about money. And that discussion turned to an argument. That argument turned to a fist fight that came in the summer. That fist fight turned to articles of secession. Those articles of secession were seen as a declaration of war, hence we have a civil war. And yet we teach our young people that it was about something other than a capitalistic system in its struggle of the best way it was going to exploit people for cheap labor, manufacturing, or in the cotton field. Having an intellectual frame to understand that when that war ended and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment was passed, it was not because Abraham Lincoln was so benevolent that he thought that should take place. It was a way to punish those who, this is coffee or gin? Larry left out the play that as we was watching this person at the Democratic Convention talking that when they was drinking, we was drinking too. And understanding Abraham Lincoln as a military strategy only threatened to issue a proclamation if the Confederate soldiers didn't put their arms down, which Jefferson Davis refused. Therefore, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation to weaken the Confederate soldiers' ability to replenish their arms and to weaken their forces. It was not a benevolent thing that it was trying to do. But as a result of that issuance, Grant and Sherman began to report that these Africans, because they were not citizens, because they didn't know which country on the continent of Africa they came from, they could only be identified as Africans, not slaves. That's a condition they was put in. They were human beings from a continent of Africa. These Africans began to pick up arms and follow the troops, and as a result of that, they defeated many of the Confederate soldiers in Mississippi alone. If you go to Vicksburg Civil War Cemetery, 40% of those buried in that cemetery, and these are both Union and Confederate soldiers, 40% are commissioned African Union soldiers. Now, what does that mean? Why is that relevant in 2017? Because if you empower people with a real history of how they are and can be empowered to take control of their destiny, you get action. And for our young people, we have to train them to say that you are not a leader because you're out front. You're only a leader if you're pushing forward leadership. Organizing is not the person in front of the room and giving the best speech. An organizer is what Charles McLaurin did in Sunflower County, Mississippi, when they were able to identify Fannie Lou Hamer, who lived in the conditions that she spoke about. And as a result of that, she became the most elegant speaker at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. But no one talked about Charles McLaurin because he was a true leader because he pushed forward Fannie Lou Hamer's leadership. And with those African soldiers who picked up arms to replenish the Union troops, we won the Civil War, and as a result of that, we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And as a result of that, we began to see engagement across the southern landscape of Africans and whites who had a fusion type of politics that began to redraw state constitutions that would meet the needs and interests of all citizens. In a state like Mississippi and Alabama, it was for the first time creating a public education system. Why? Because only white males of privilege was entitled to any level of education at private expense, and the white females of privilege were only being groomed to be good suitors for those landowners. Oppression sometimes is not about race or gender, it's about power. And race and gender and ethnic background are only tools to divide. In many states across this country, in our national political landscape, if you put a black face or a Latino face on public policy, people vote against their interest. Race is a tool, it's a social construct that has been used very effectively here in this state of Ohio. Can you imagine the level of economic insecurity that people are facing during these times, and they actually went to the polls and voted for he who shall not be named? Thinking that he will have a solution for them when his whole life has been about exploiting them. And I'm not talking about black folks, I'm not talking about Latinos, I'm talking about white males. He's had a history of exploiting working class people. He comes from a set of individuals who are anti-intellectuals. They think we're all communists because we read books. We understand theories. That's the political reality we're living in. And the beautiful thing about schools situated like Antioch or Tougaloo or Berea or many other schools is that we are the manufacturers of the critical thinkers for tomorrow, if we do it right. You know, the educational industrial complex is a very tricky thing. It's less about training critical thinkers and more about training your labor force or generating profits down. So what's going on with the whole for-profit college industry? Has nothing to do with training a quality workforce. It's about generating profit and exploiting people in ways in which they can receive the federal benefits that was supposed to go towards our communities across the landscape, getting a leg up and getting access to higher education. Now they figure out a way to exploit those opportunities. But liberal arts colleges, small as they may be, have always been the center of influence, the progressive pull to the other side, the opportunity for us to think and do what is in the higher value for all of society. So I'm grateful for being here. In fact, I didn't know it existed. No more so that when I got on Tougaloo College campus, I told somebody, I said, I'm going to Tougaloo. They said, you're going to Tougaboo? What is that? But you think about the impact that this school has had. Think about how well placed some of your alumni are. You know, David Goodman comes to Mississippi like Larry do, and it's like, he's a very successful business guy with a social consciousness. He didn't wake up that way. That was trained, and it was developed, and it evolved because of institutions like this. And so when you fast forward and you begin to look at the civil rights movement as it evolved, and I sit and I talk to many of the veterans, some of whom no longer with us, I said, how do we get here? Part of that continuum. And you had individuals who took up arms, and they reinforced the Union troops, and they developed fusion politics, and they began to try to develop what we call a more perfect union, and that was thwarted by a backlash called during the redemption period. And when that happened, many of the southern states changed their constitutions. They implemented policy to suppress the vote of African Americans who was voting at a high percentage. And it was because of a deal, because the Republicans, Lincoln's party, wanted Rutherford B. Hayes to be the governor. And they wanted Rutherford B. Hayes to be governor because they wanted to maintain laissez-faire government. And with laissez-faire government, it meant nothing about the quality of lives for African Americans, anyone else. It was about a business agenda. And that deal that was cut, Hayes-Tilden deal, removed the federal troops. And as a result of that, we've seen a backlash like we had never seen before, but like we're looking at today. But there were some individuals, W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, who called for a meeting in Niagara, Canada, was they recognized in 1907 all of the progress that had been made were being reversed, had been reversed. And they want to put intellectuals together in Niagara to talk about what they call the Negro question. But in Mississippi, a group of individuals who operate under a banner called M.W. Stringer Grand Lodge, Prince Hall Mason, wanted to make sure Mississippi had a voice in the room. So they paid for one of their members to attend. Her name was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells came back. She gave a report about the movement, is what she called it. So M.W. Stringer Grand Lodge said, we're going to support the movement. 2 years later, a year and a half later, there was a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, and Mary Wright Overton and other whites say this is not a democracy when people are being lynched on average once a day. So they asked those individuals who met in Niagara to meet with them in New York, black, white, male, female, to talk about the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they did it as an advocacy organization. The first thing they took on was anti-lynching legislation, because during this time, the federal government had no authority to go into a state, investigate crimes, prosecute those who were involved, and convict those who were guilty. Successful legislation. It is the foundation that gives the federal government now to come and investigate police shootings. There's very little new under the sun. And from that started a movement, not only in Mississippi, but across the southern landscape. And then there was this doctor who studied at Meharry Medical School. He did his residency in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. Dr., I always get initials wrong, R.T.M. Howard, who as a result of his successful practice in his pushback against what was taking place in the state, when World War II veterans came home, Medgar Evers, Aaron Henry, Amzie Moore, Hartman Turnbull, Vernon Damer, Gilbert Mason, he convened them, and they began to operate under the banner of NAACP, and they built an infrastructure. There was a woman who worked out of New York for the national NAACP who walked away, because guess what? Black men can be chauvinists too, by the name of Ella Baker. And she knew about this infrastructure in Mississippi, so when she began to conceptualize this thing called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the second attempt that was taking place, and she and Bayard Rusher began to talk about it. Bayard was in the background. Why? Because he was a known communist and gay, and back in the 40s and 50s, you couldn't be out front gay and communist? And black? Good Lord. And they had these young people to come to a school in North Carolina called Shaw College. And they had a meeting. Ella Baker had this concept that strong people don't need strong leaders. Strong people don't need strong leaders. She also understood it was the role of schools like Shaw and Antioch to build strong people, critical thinkers. And in that moment, they organized SNCC. First chairman is a brother by the name of Chuck McDough. Now, Chuck tells the story one way, and Larry tells the story another way. Chuck said he was dating this fine woman who went to Antioch. And he came to visit, and Larry was in there talking smack. And Larry said he woke up and he was in Southwest Georgia. He didn't know what the hell he was thinking about by being in Southwest Georgia, organizing that SNCC. Antioch was one of the safe havens. People can come, be engaged in the Deep South, and come and have a safe space. But Ella Baker knew about this infrastructure in Mississippi at the same time. And so when Bob Moses recruited, she sent him to to those World War II veterans who had built an infrastructure. And where Larry and others was in Southwest Georgia with the Albany project, it didn't go so well because John Lewis and others felt you can appeal to man's heart. But that was this emerging new group of SNCC activists out of Howard and out of Tougaloo. Stokely Carmichael, Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobbs, Howard, Lawrence Guillot, Curtis Hayes, Mike Arthur Cotton, Tougaloo. And they felt that the heart was just like another organ in the body, just like a liver. And they realized that outcomes had to be what they saw, and policy outcomes, because in a democracy, our vote is our currency. And that any time that a democracy is weak, capital exploits. When democracy is weak, capital exploit. But when democracy is strong, it places accountability on capital so it don't exploit people. And that the whole movement in Mississippi was based on the premise that they had to lead from behind, that the infrastructure of World War II veterans who were now the NAACP presidents across the landscape, the foundation I stand on, that they understood that movements are intergenerational, that young people's energy was necessary, but the wisdom of the older people was also necessary. And that there had to be intersecting points where everyone would come together. And out of that, we get Freedom Summer. We get the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We get the passage of the Civil Rights Act. We get the expansion of this concept that community rural health centers was a civil rights, therefore we have them all across the country right now. And they understood that foundational to the movement of any movement was whether or not capital would exploit people for free or cheap labor. That's where we are right now. It is about who gets taxed, who's not taxed, and what the tax dollars are spent on. And out of that comes the question of who will have access to leverage their franchise, their vote, to influence the tax policy. And out of that comes the laws that protect the right of workers. And out of that come public policy around the role of government in providing many things. We are watching, and before our eyes right now, a redefinition of the role of government. But because of schools like Antioch College, we do have a future. And I commend every one of you who worked hard to save this school. To save this school. Because movements don't have a color, don't have a race, don't have a sexual orientation. They have a value system. And if our collective value system is that all human beings should be respected and treated with dignity, we must connect as a human race. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I think we're going to do questions and answers, or? Oh, Jan. Okay, I'm sorry.
Before we do that, I wanted to present Derrick with a free button. Because you do this so much, you shouldn't have to pay for a button that says you do it. So
Thank you.
Keep up the good work. And then with an Antioch pin, which I know you can all see from here, Thank you so much for being part of our community.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to introduce Jan. So I want to introduce our moderator, Jan Bandor, who's a member of the class of 1967 by coincidence. It's great that you show up for your 50th. That's good. Jan is a recognized activist, and she'll reflect on Derrick Johnson's remarks and lead us in a Q&A, which at Antioch often stands for, as you know, quarrel and argue. Jan is a women's rights activist and is known as the founding mother of the Rape Crisis Center movement in Michigan. In 1991, she was named to the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. She currently works as producer of QED Video and has worked as an adjunct instructor at Eastern Michigan University's School of Social Work. She continues to be an active supporter of women's rights in local government, and most recently is involved in, or for a long time, not just recently, in voting rights in Michigan, and is about to work with others to file a petition for a constitutional amendment to outlaw political gerrymandering. Jan. You also get a button.
Thank you, Tom. Oh, I have so many buttons. This is wonderful. I won't need to wear any clothes. You can tell I'm a college teacher. I always bring my books with me. I was 13 when I joined SNCC. I came to Antioch at the age of 17. Now, the whole time I was in high school, they told me I had a problem with authority. But then I got to Antioch and I discovered that the opposite was true, that authority had a problem with me. Question authority and speak truth to power, and don't stop. And thank you so much, Derrick, for bringing us to the present with the challenges that we face. It's so exciting that we can look back and see how much was accomplished by what was in many ways a children's crusade. If you take a look at Parting the Waters, Taylor Branch's Pulitzer Prize book about the King years, at first it looks kind of like it was all a bunch of grown-ups, but then you get to about the middle of the book and you realize it was some really, really naive kids at Greensboro College and a bunch of colleges in North Carolina in 1959, and they just decided to go to the Woolworth lunch counter and see what happened. They didn't have a plan or a strategy. They just did something. They were courageous beyond their years, but they didn't really have it very well worked out. And they kind of forced the hand of the grown-ups to get busy, to do some more things. And so in 1964, you've got Freedom Summer, another children's crusade. Remembering Mississippi Freedom Summer is a book by one of my high school friends. And Charlie Prickett, he lived this. And just to give you a sense for how clueless they were, each day began with a search for food, water, a bathroom, and something to do to further the struggle for civil rights. Every day was a new adventure. For example, we would get up and look for a place to pee. And so they had to fix the plumbing and do some really basic things before they even had an infrastructure from which to go and register people to vote and teach kids how to read and do all the things that they accomplished. Now, we have much bigger challenges into how do we communicate these hard-won lessons to the newer generations. How do we unite to make sure we don't reinvent the past, and we don't reinvent the wheel of hard-won knowledge, and move forward. And I would submit to you that if we're looking at some really important targets for right now, and this really started in the 80s, it's the new Jim Crow. It's the mass incarceration of black men in this country. Michelle Alexander's book is a very important read because what we've done is tear apart community after community all over the country. The North is suffering as badly as the South, if not worse. In Chicago, something like 70% of black men have a felony record. And if you have a felony record in most states, you can't vote, you can't hold a job, you can't become licensed to hold a profession. You are permanently stuck. It is as bad as Jim Crow, and as the author points out, it's a power structure that works even better than Jim Crow did to keep people in their place. We have to fight that, and it's a wonderful opportunity to unite young people and older people together because it's the drug war that started this whole thing. Nancy Reagan, just say no. Thanks, Nancy. You just put millions of people in prison. And I think that's a winner, where we can get young activists for drug legalization together with those who've been fighting this mass incarceration, mandatory minimum sentences, all of that garbage has got to stop. And that's legislation that we can accomplish if we are really, really determined. In setting up kind of a discussion here today, I'd like to kind of highlight some of Derrick's really good questions that I think we as a community can start to answer here today. What can we accomplish through protest? Now, I was one of almost 1 million people in New York City for the climate march. What did we accomplish with that? I was one of 800,000 women for the Women's March in March. What did we accomplish? Now, I think early on protests, of course they raised money. Protests were also good because they showed what people were really thinking and feeling. And in the case of Lyndon Johnson, we embarrassed the hell out of him. And he got busy, and so we got the Voting Rights Act, and we got Medicare, and we got a bunch of really important things. What do we do today with protests? What does that accomplish? We have to answer that question. We have to do a lot more than just make waves and make, temporary television footage. What about voting? I keep hearing, well, we've just got to get more good people out to vote. Well, wait a minute. You know what happened in the Georgia 6th? A lot of people came out and voted. And who won? Ossoff didn't win. What happened? Georgia's system of voting is a completely porous digital nightmare. It was completely rigged. And I've been talking to computer scientists. I've been part of the digital security movement for voting. How did that happen? How did we let the Help America Vote Act passed in 2003 that forced every state to use electronic vote counting? And now we can't count our votes and trust the result. And Jesse Jackson has actually said, it was great to have the right to vote be a movement, but the new civil rights goal is to have your vote counted accurately. And he's right. So how do we create an intellectual framework where people can understand how we get these changes? We had wonderful training in the 60s. It was called nonviolence. and you practiced and you practiced. So if the KKK were dragging you, you just went limp, and they had to do all the work, and they couldn't say that you were even resisting arrest if the cops came. That was great training. How do we train people now? Especially when we've got cops who are nervous and trigger happy, and they're just ready to overreact. They're not very well trained. I used to do police training, and I can tell you that a lot of police now, they just come straight out of the military, and they get 12 weeks of training. What good is that? Enough training? No, it's not. How do we get the generations together in a really effective way? How do we create projects where younger people and older people can come together and communicate effectively and get stuff done? And I've seen that happen, and when it happens, it's amazing. The movement to stop dealing with apartheid in South Africa, that was an example where students worked on university holdings, and it worked. So these are some questions that I hope we can address for the rest of our time. And do I see a hand of someone who wants to ask a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Really appreciate all of your comments. Wondering what Mr. Johnson has to say in response to some of those thoughts that you have, and also to open up to questions.
I think the voting question is the most critical question that we have to address with real solutions. If Australia can have compulsory voting in 200 other countries, why shouldn't we? Right? That's problem. Secondly, why do states have restricted polling places? I get off work, I drive past 2 or 3 precincts before I go to my precinct. The technology is there for us to be able to vote at any precinct that we stop. And the third one, and every time I mention this to a new crowd, it's shocking, but why do we need voter registration? It is a vote suppression method that if states have moved to go to voter ID, great. I can accept that. Let's get rid of voter registration and go to compulsory voting. We're citizens. Why shouldn't we have to fill out an application to exercise our right to vote? So that's the most critical thing that I see.
Question over in the back there.
This was a great talk. Thanks for it was a great opportunity to get to hear you speak. And since you're based in Jackson, I was wondering if you would just say anything about how you feel about Chokwe Antar Lumumba being elected, and about the work of Cooperation Jackson happening out there in your city.
Right. So it's interesting. I'm originally from Detroit, and when I got to Tougaloo, I was immediately taken to Chokwe Lumumba, the father, right? Because he's from Detroit, and he played basketball on campus. Tougaloo is similar. It's a community school for advocates. I mean, I remember getting there, you had the black nationalists arguing against the Pan-Africanists, arguing against the Nation of Islam, arguing against, and I was some integrated sellout because I was with the NAACP. But Chokwe became a mentor. And as they were organizing the Malcolm X Grassroots Network, I was at many of those meetings. Antar was 9 years old. I lived 4 houses down from Chokwe before he died. So I'm very close to Antar and Rakid's sister. And so we helped Antar get elected. And I'm in regular communication with him. His chief of staff is like his stepmother and my mother, and she's the chair of my board. So I hope that answers your question. All right.
Let's take a question from this side. Want to wait for the mic so everybody can hear you?
Okay, I'm Joan Stockton, class of '65. A couple things occurred to me listening, and one is the problem of felons and not being able to vote. Well, maybe we need an amendment to the Constitution that says everybody at the point that they're born in this country and they get their Social Security number, They get registered, and when it comes time to vote, they vote whether they are in prison or not.
So ironically, there are several states, Mississippi being one of them, where prisoners can vote. Can. You know, Jim Crow laws and those who implement them, they weren't the smartest bunch in the world. Our Constitution of 1890, when it was being considered, they made as a disenfranchising crime 10 crimes only they thought blacks were more likely to commit. Right? Like theft, obtaining money or goods under false pretense, which is not necessarily, it's a bad check, it's not a felony. Some are felonies, some are not. So you look at 2017, the number one crime African Americans or any individual in the state was convicted of was drug crimes. Drug was not one of the 10 crimes. So about 2/3 of the people sitting in jail can currently vote. Franchising laws differ from state to state. We always have to be careful when we paint the broad brush that felons can't vote. It is a very state-specific reality that was driven by the business interest at the time the Constitution or the legislature was being adopted.
There's a question in the back. Where's our microphone?
Not that I want to take you away from what you're doing, but Tom decides to hire you to teach here. What's your class going to be?
So, in fact, I teach a class in the fall semester at Tougaloo, adjunct professor, where I get 10 students. We're a small school also. And with those 10 students, I had a partnership with Lonnie Grenier at Harvard Law School, where she gave me 5 students to come down during their winter break. So I partnered my 10 students who finished in the fall with the 5 students, and we assigned them to a member of the legislature. Our legislators don't have staff. The goal of the project is to build a network of progressive critical thinkers who can be exposed to how public policy is actually developed. And then my 10 Tougaloo students, in the fall, I would lecture Lonnie's class. She had a class called The Law of Social Justice. And I take the students up and I would lecture the class. She hasn't taught the class the last 2 years, so we're recalibrating and we're going to partner with another professor. So I do teach a class in the fall.
Balls in your court.
On this side. All right. This side. Gentleman in the 3rd row. Oh, you're going to get one in the back first? Okay, we'll come back to you.
What about laws which in some locations or countries require or pay people to vote to get more of a turnout, especially in depressed areas?
It's actually a federal crime to pay for votes. Right. So the real conversation we got to have is how do we make voting a federal requirement with all of the necessary federal protections? Because voting is a state-by-state, law-driven reality. There's some overarching stuff that the Voting Rights Act protect against based on class, race, and ethnic background, but that's not enough. We need a federal system of uniformity. So how voting is done in one state, it mirrors the other state, and there's a lot of transparency. Jan talked about the voting machines. So what we did in the county I live in, because we have control of the election board, we had them get new machines with the Scantron sheets. So it meets the requirement of HAVA, the technology part, but we have a paper verifiable trace that if we need to go back and count, we have the paper to count, because Diebold, which was based in Ohio, we know those machines can be rigged. And the problem is too many machines do not have a paper verifiable trace.
We have a question over here that you've been patiently waiting at the end of the first row. We need a microphone. Oh, you got it, okay.
Okay. My name is Alicia Williams. I'm a 1981 alumni, graduate of Antioch College, and I have a brief testimony. I came to Antioch College. I didn't know I had ADD, attention deficit disorder. I went to Mills College for women, and I went to Howard University. Then I went to the library and I looked up alternative colleges because I didn't test well. I read and I understood, but I didn't test well. I came to Antioch and I found my perfect fit for education. In recruitment, you need to look at the people, minorities, students that have learning disabilities, that learn better under this social environment than they do in other universities. You also need to have money available. I took out so many student loans, and I ended up on Social Security disability because I'm bipolar. I didn't know I was bipolar when I was at Antioch. I had some of the symptoms, but I had a professor, I was pre-med, and one of the chemistry professors was racist. He did not pass students in organic chemistry and chemistry minorities because he felt they wanted an easy way to medical school. I took this to the dean of students. I had an open forum about racism and sexism at Antioch College. I brought that professor and taught him that his ideas were wrong, to think that just because you're minority and you don't test well on your organic chemistry doesn't mean you can't be a doctor. I have mental illness in my family, drug addiction, suicide. I have 36 years as a social worker, and I've worked in Greene County 8 years for TCN Behavioral Health Care. I'm having an open forum on July 28th in the police department gymnasium from 5:30 to 8 p.m. And I'm going to discuss with the police, the community, everybody involved with mental illness. Heroin is so strong. People are dying around here. Heroin addiction is so strong. Rob Portman needs to be called about health care. We need activists like me that are wanting to sensitize people to mental illness and to addiction and how to recover. And I have information if you're interested in what I do. And I bring people together. I brought Congressman Steve Austria from Columbus for mental health by knocking on his door in Columbus.
Thank you very much for your informative comments. I think we need to move on because we're limited in time. We had a question over here, our next speaker.
I have two questions. One is, I understand the new mayor of Jackson, Mississippi is an African American who says he will make Jackson the most radical city in the world. I wonder what that means. My second question is quite different. Been reading Naomi Klein's new book, No Is Not Enough, and another book called Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be. They both make really strong cases for rethinking resistance, for rethinking civil disobedience, for understanding, now I don't have a clear position myself on this, but the Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be book suggests that it's time to recognize that certain kinds of violence are legitimate in political action, violence against property rather than against people, and that often threats of violence have brought the possibility of genuine nonviolence to be taken seriously. I was curious about where all this fits into your understanding of where we are. We're in a crisis, obviously, with the Washington administration, with climate change, with race, with everything else. So if you begin with the Jackson, Mississippi mayor, I'm really interested in that, and then the other question.
So your last question first, and I'll get to the mayor.
Okay.
Every action has a reaction. And if we begin to advocate levels of violence because we disagree with certain things, we also have to be prepared for the reaction. And so I come from a community that we're well aware that if we take the violent line, what could happen to us with no sympathy from the broader community. So I'm very careful by having those conversations, because just the notion of a set of individuals saying we should be more violent could have a negative reaction that could justify additional mass incarceration, among other things. So I'm always careful with that. Antioch, when he gave his State of the Union, State of the City address, his inaugural address, big ideals. I remember Congressman Thompson came up after me and said, I remember when I was 33 years old too. It's good to have big ideals. But what he's trying to do as mayor, he wants to look at how do you deconstruct a municipal government and reconstruct it in more of the image of the citizens it represents. That's a radical notion. How do you rethink how individuals provide services to the city who don't live in the city? Or how do you remove a lot of the private contractors out of the process and employ more people by the city? Because what we're beginning to see across the landscape, the big city machines have dwindled or been captured by corporate interests. And as a result, there are fewer jobs for people. And so how do we rethink the role of local government as we're watching a redefinition of the federal government?
The woman in the green had her hand up. Thank you.
I'm not sure. Oh, I have a real concern about what's happening to education in this country, because from Betsy DeVos on down, there's a real assault on public education. What are your thoughts on this?
We are in real dangerous territory, and we've been here for a while now. Betsy DeVos have funded some of the worst so-called educational options out there. And when you look at the devices they're talking about using, and I bring it to a Southern or Mississippi context, it's the same thing that was being talked about to fight against integrating school, right? School choice, or I look at charter schools. Well, if we put that in a Mississippi context, after the 1955 Brown versus Board decision on deliberate speed, Southern states put more emphasis on deliberate and no emphasis on speed so they can set up segregated private academies and divert public funds for those academies. That's charter schools today, right? School vouchers. In 1960, Mississippi legislator and Alabama and several other southern states, they adopted private academy tuition vouchers for white residents who did not want to send their kids to schools with black kids so they can go to the private Christian segregated academies. We call it school vouchers today. Tax credits. Georgia had that experiment, and it was supposed to help poor and minority kids, and when an analysis was done, not a single poor and minority kid received the credits. The families who were already sending their kids to private school settings got the tax credits. Therefore, it did not benefit. Our education system was built state by state to meet the need of the industries of those states. So when I was in Detroit, I knew all about building a car. Okay? And had I gone to school in another area, it would have been another industry. We need to really redesign and rethink our education system based on something like the Finland model, or any other nation that have stepped back and realized to be competitive in what is a global economy, we need a new and different time of workforce. And the capital class don't want people to get high quality education because it's harder to exploit people for cheap labor if you educate them.
Just a point of personal privilege, since I'm from Michigan, I do want to apologize for Betsy DeVos. And her brother, Eric Prince, Mr. Blackwater. But you have to understand that they are descended from Dutch fascists who were kicked out of Holland because they were such fascists. And they went to Western Michigan and formed a little enclave. We're still dealing with them. Question over here. Gentlemen, you had your hand up earlier.
You got the lady in the back.
Yeah, in the back. So we got a couple people, but why don't you go ahead? You've had yours up.
Excuse me.
My understanding of the whole point of movement and organizing is to win people over, and I don't think anybody, including me, is going to be won over by throwing a brick through a bank window. We already know banks are screwing people. I mean, I don't understand that. You got to win people over. You're not going to win people over by breaking things. I just want to say that.
We had a question over here. Hand up, down. Oh.
Hi,
Okay, we had someone down here. Did you have your hand? Did you get your answer? She got it. Okay. Okay. Good.
Okay. Hi, I'm Santoy Trotter, class of '92. Thank you, Derrick Johnson, so much for your talk. And I just wanted to speak to the provocative point of Ferguson being a failure, and just kind of a little bit what I hear of a theme of like we need more than protest, and clearly we do. And I want to say that yes, we need electoral change and policy change. And if I think about a few months ago when there was the Muslim ban by Trump, and I took my son and my family and went down to the San Francisco airport with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people and protested until they released folks that they were holding. That protest also just builds fire in our hearts. It builds connection with one another, and it's a part of the movement. It's not the only movement. And so I just wanted to name that and say that as well.
And with that, I do agree that it's a part of the movement. Unfortunately, we have too many people in the 60s and now who the headlines is the movement for them. And so the context I was speaking to the young people was dealing with a voting rights frame. So if you say that, did Ferguson energize people? Absolutely. Did it encourage people to get involved? Absolutely. Did it democratize information? We see the evidence of that. But did it materially change the quality of life of the people who lived in that city under that oppressive regime? No, it did not. Failure.
The gentleman here, you had your hand up. Do we have a mic in the neighborhood? Great.
And so, actually, just to I hate the word piggyback, but I'm going to say it anyway because I can't think of the other word. What do you do with that failure? How do you take a community that feels completely disempowered, completely disenfranchised, where there is the community, it's based on hopelessness, right? Because you don't have jobs, you've got poor health care, education is out the window, brothers are being placed in jail and so on. So what message do you give to folk? Because this is like very much the choir. And so, yes. What's the message for folks who really need to move themselves first and move their families and then community and so on forward?
Mm-hmm. So since this is a choir, we're going to do an A and B selection. I'm Baptist, so we can sing. No, valid point. I think the challenge for us in our liberal arts progressive colleges is to begin to redefine movements and what our role should be. In a Ferguson context, let me use the Jackson, Mississippi and a Ferguson. In Jackson, Mississippi, you had a group of young individuals who would come into the city and they would intentionally attack homeless African-American people, resulting in a James Craig Anderson incident that was on the news where they ran over the guy, right? There was 9 individuals. Every last one of them were charged and convicted and now serving time. Jackson, Mississippi is 70% African-American. Ferguson is 67% African-American. But what's the difference? The movement in Jackson allowed for changing of those individuals who serve in office. So investigating the incident was the police chief, African-American, Prosecuting the incident originally was a state AG, my classmate, which then it was bumped up to a federal crime, the U.S. Attorney, African American. The judge who oversaw the case, African American. The U.S. Marshal who was in it, African American, and the warden of the prison that they were sent to, African American. That happened because there was ongoing systemic organizing in that community, put people in place who would be accountable to those type of atrocities. In Ferguson, we as organizers need to figure out the best approach to go and meet the community where they are and push leadership forward and help design a strategy. Not for us to be on the news, but for them to take control of their vote. In a democracy, your vote is your currency. And if we don't really leverage it, we will continue to get more Fergusons or Baton Rouge or whatever the case may be, and we have to change that dynamic. Protest is good. It raises the energy, the spectrum, get people involved, but the systemic problem, we got to have a systemic solution, and in a democracy, the vote is the currency.
We have time for one more question, and then I want to give Derrick a chance to talk to us briefly about how we can stay connected with what he's doing.
Okay, yeah, my name is Cheryl Smith. I'm with Black Lives Matter Miami Valley. I would like to ask your opinion in this area. The local NAACP was involved in the John Crawford III case, and just recently the Department of Justice determined that a young man shopping at Walmart carrying a toy can be murdered in 1.3 seconds, and his civil rights are not violated. I would like you to speak to that, please.
We're seeing that across the country, unfortunately. Do I have a quick fix solution for this community? No. I mean, I don't think anyone do. But I do think it's an assessment point of what are the leveraging opportunities to change that type of landscape. In the way in which this community figure out what powers do we have proactively to change the makeup of the DA office. DAs are elected. Oftentimes they go unopposed. One of the things we had to do, in my context, we had a 26-year DA who had been in office, and he was listed as one of the worst in the country by the New York Times. In a district that was about 47% African American, so it wasn't a majority African American district, in a state where racial block voting is the norm. You put a black guy on the ballot or a white person on the ballot, racial block voting kick in, very few whites vote for the black person. But this DA also was exploiting and mistreating whites as well, particularly working class whites. And so we recruited a 33-year-old, we have a leadership institute, we got him to run, we put forth a strategy. He beat that 26-year incumbent. He beat that, right? We were not the majority, we had a large population, but we stepped back and said, what can we do to change this reality? That incumbent had only had one challenger in 26 years. So now we have a full-fledged DA program where we're identifying bad district attorneys because their discretion is so vast. They determine who's charged, who's not, what they're charged for, whether or not they give a fair plea agreement or not, whether or not they even go after bad actor cops. Much of it rests in a DA department, and that's a local solution that, the community got to step back and proactively chart a course where you can address that issue for the next time there's a child at Walmart shopping.
So, Derrick, can you tell us briefly how can interested people here stay in touch with what you're up to and contribute?
Call Larry. I I am based in Jackson, Mississippi. I was fortunate enough to get elected as vice chair of the NHP National Board of Directors. I just believe all work is local. And so I think one of the most profound, it's not asking a question, work that we're doing right now is organizing individuals who reside in areas serviced by electric cooperatives. There are 930 across the country. Many of them have not been held accountable by the member owners, the ratepayer member owners. And so now we're organizing those communities to begin to get engaged with the governance of the company they own. You have a bunch of them right here in Ohio. I think that is one of the most fertile national campaigns we can take on, because what we learn is it is the electric company that certifies sites for development. They're one of the, their business models to get more ratepayers on their grid. They're an entity that can determine what type of renewable energy mixes should be a part of their offerings. And they could be one of the key areas to help with economic insecurity and bring it down for low-wealth communities. This is some of the works that we're doing, and I think that's a good intersecting point because they exist in 47 states across the country. And so I'm available. My email is my name, DerrickJohnson@hotmail.com. I check it once a week, so I get 3,000. I check it every day. I check it every day. All right? But I'm open. I mean, how to stay in touch. I really don't have a formal way other than I'm here, and if people call, I'm available if I can be supportive.
And now we'll hear from President Manley.
Just thank you again, Derrick Johnson. Thank you, Jan.